whenever I hear Adventists talk about this too, they don't seem to point this out. And maybe I'm missing something, so someone can help me. But even Adventists will say, well, the biblical calendar is a lunar calendar with 12 30-day months. And they say that before they go into talking about the day for a year. But here's the thing. The literal Jewish calendar, as in from year to year, the way the Hebrews kept time all the way back into Daniel's time and through history, through the 70 weeks of years, through history, even to this day, the Jews did not keep a 12-month year with 30 days in each month. They can't, and they can't according to Scripture. But we don't think the lunar calendar is that we see the increments of time used in prophecy. We don't think that that's exactly the same one they used in history anyways. But we never talk about this. They didn't actually have 360 days or 12 30-day months per year in actual history, like when the real Hebrew people were keeping time, which actually goes to demonstrate why the day for a year and the biblical prophetic calendar is different, showing that it's not a literal time. See, because every other system of, it wasn't always historically this way, but currently, as far as I can tell, anybody who doesn't affirm the day for year prophecy, they think the time, like the 1260 days and the 42 months, they take those literal, whether you're preterist or futurist. The preterist will try to put it in the past. Futurist will say it's going to happen in the future. Well, that's a problem, because as you can see by this chart on the screen, which I'll zoom in on, I'm going to try to make this brief and succinct. They agree with us. Essentially, they see this pattern in Revelation 11, 12, and 13, and Daniel 7, which they don't list here. But notice it says 3.5 years occurs 5 times in Revelation. 3.5 years times 2 is 7. Because see, they think the 70th week of Daniel is in the future, because they make the verse about Jesus bringing the new covenant about Satan in the future, putting Jesus' death outside of the 70 weeks, falsifying that he's Messiah without realizing it. Of course, they don't think he's not the Messiah, but the reading of Scripture puts his death outside the 70 weeks, which makes his atoning death and bringing in everlasting righteousness outside of the prophecy as the text is written. If you just let it speak, they just overlook it and just keep on pressing that the 70th week is future, because they think it just makes so much sense that this 3.5 years is mentioned so many times. And then they think there can't be a desolation, or there can't be a time of trouble without the 7 years, which is not true, of course. But notice, they're right. The 3.5 years, the 42 months, the 1260 days, the times and half a time, they're the same thing. Don't be confused. It's all the same amount of time expressed in different ways. I've even heard him say it's obviously literal, because they mentioned it in all these increments, not knowing that the actual rendering does not use the sort of historic narrative way of saying 3 years and 6 months in literal narrative everywhere else in the historical literal narrative of the Bible and regular genre of history. But all these ways in the apocalyptic literature, it uses these weird increments, all of which I'm going to demonstrate right now cannot be literal, because even the futurists, notice, they recognize that this is talking about the same thing. 3.5 years is 42 months, is 1260 days, is the time. Yes, indeed. Notice here too, by the way, the woman fleeing in the wilderness from Revelation 12, it uses the times and half a times, which is the throwback to Daniel 7, which shows you. See, they want to make that future about Israel, Revelation 12, totally off base. It's clearly sweeping through history. And it's the times and half a time is the oppression by the fourth kingdom, Rome. So that all being said, though, I want to point something out. Let me give you a little crash course on the actual historic Hebrew reckoning of time throughout a year. So a lunar year is really just 12 months and they're 30 days each, which would make a 360-day year. And so, yes, on a lunar calendar, 3.5 years is exactly 1,260 days with 30-day months times, 42 months, right? 42 months. See, but here's the issue. We know that the days represent years, but all other groups who deny the day-year principle, even though they use it for the 70 weeks, they don't realize this, and it seems like Adventists don't either. But notice, how can those be literal? Is there 30 days, 12 months every year on in the Hebrew literal historical calendar in their daily lives? Which is absolutely, they think the 7 years, 70th week is future, and that the 1260 days is the same thing, right? But we're 3.5 year periods in the first 69 weeks, 42 months, or 1260 days every 3.5 years. And the answer is absolutely not, nor can it be. Why is that? The Hebrew calendar is the one they actually use historically from, in time, is actually a lunisolar calendar, because it by necessity, and we know this historically because when we count years and we correlate it in archaeology and biblical studies, we know that the cultures were made adjustments to their calendar in order that they stay accurate with the seasons and actual real year as we understand it today, which they didn't, of course, but they would know their seasons would be off if they were doing it wrong. So the Hebrew calendar is actually lunisolar, meaning the months are based from month to month. Yes, you cite the moon and then you do the month, but years are based on solar years. The calendar year features 12 lunar months of 29 or 30 days with an intercalary lunar month added periodically to synchronize the 12 lunar cycles with the longer solar year. These extra months are added 7 times every 19 years. So there's a 19-year cycle. 7 of the years in the 19-year cycle, which starts over every 19 years, 7 of the years must have a 13th month added. The beginning of each Jewish lunar month is based on the appearance of the moon, although originally the new lunar crescent had to be observed and certified by witnesses that cited the moon. Then that's the new month. That's how you know the new month is, because as you see here, the mean period of a lunar month, precisely the synodic month, is very close to about 29.5 days. And of course, you can't make it 29.5 days because days just cycle one after the other. So accordingly, the basic Hebrew calendar year is one of 12 lunar months, and those months are 29 or 30 days long. Here's a list of the biblical months and then how they correlate to the Gregorian calendar. And you can see 30, 29, 30, because they're based on the moon. So it would fluctuate, right? Because a cycle of the moon is actually 29.5 days. You can see here that after the 11th month, on the years that they would add the 13th month by necessity, 7 out of every 19 years, they'd add a second Adar, which would be 30 days long every time when that's added, okay? Now, justification for leap months. The insertion of the leap month mentioned above is based on the requirement that the Passover, the festival celebrating the Exodus from Egypt, which took place in the spring, always occurs in the spring season. Since the adoption of a fixed calendar, intercalations in the Hebrew calendar have been assigned. So that's the way they do it now because of astronomical knowledge, etc. They do it a little bit differently. But notice Maimonides, Jewish rabbi, discussing the calendrical rules in the Mishnah. He notes this: by how much does the solar year, that is a true year, as we understand it today, exceed a lunar year? By approximately 11 days. In other words, the lunar rendering is 11 days short of a true year. Therefore, whenever this excess accumulates to about 30 days or a little more or less, 1 month is added and the particular year is made to consist of 13 months. And this is the so-called embolismic or intercalated year. For the year could not consist of 12 months plus so and so many days, since it is said throughout the months of the year, which implies that we should count the year by months and not days. So anybody who says the real biblical calendar has X amount of days in a year, impossible. You can rule it out. Because any system, even if they had known, and I think the only claimed one would be the Enochian calendar, which says in the book of Jubilees and elsewhere that the true biblical year has 364 days per year in it, which we know, of course, isn't a true year. A true year is 365 days long, 365 2425 to take it to the 10,000th decimal place. That means on the Gregorian calendar, we add an extra day every 4 years to the month of February. Why? Because a true year is 365 days, 365.2425. It's almost a quarter day. So we add, after 4 years, 4 quarter days is an extra day. So we add that extra day every 4 years to make up for that. But that's still not quite right. So we still have basically 1.0075 days off with that. But it would take about 10,000 years to be 3/4 of a day off. So it's not really a problem. It's quite accurate. The Bible does not directly mention the addition of this intercalary month. However, with the insertion of this month, Jewish festivals, without it, the Jewish festivals of this would shift outside of the seasons required by Torah. So think about it. Since without doing this extra month every so often, you're about 11 days short of a true year. So say you correlate that with like the Gregorian calendar, which is basically perfectly accurate for the true length of the year until the cycle of the season starts over. It's 11 days short. So if you just did it every 354th day, and then 354 days later, you do the Passover again, you'd be 11 days behind from the year before regarding its point in the seasons. And then if you did that again, you'd be 22 days. And then another year, you'd be 33 days because you keep shifting more, you keep going 11 more days behind. What would happen? Well, after 3 years, you'd be over a month out of season. Why does that matter? Because sheep breed and give birth to lambs at a certain time of the year. And you have to have a lamb to do the Passovers. And the Passover is connected to the first fruits and the unleavened bread. And that requires the wave sheaf offering, which is needed to happen during the seasons when you get your crops, your first crops. So it must land in the appropriate time of the year in the season. So as we can see here, I'm going to show you this chart. So the 12-month years have 353 plus or minus 1 day. And then the years with the 13th month have 384 days plus or minus 1 day. Because there's another adjustment they do according to certain festivals. Once they sighted the moon, certain months could have 29 or 30 days appropriately, so that because there were particular, I think that was a Chesvan or in Kislev, see there on the right side, that would be adjusted so that those certain festivals, Sabbaths, would not land on a weekly Sabbath as set out in Scripture. And there's verses for that. I just don't have them on here. And so that was another adjustment they made, and that's why that's plus or minus 1 day. So when they added the 13th month, which was 30 days, you just add 30 days to 354, and the plus or minus 1 day is according to what I just described, which could also happen during a 13th month year here. So you have 383, 384, 385 is the possible amount of days in a 13th month year, as that basically describes here. It was to prevent Rosh Hashanah and other holidays from falling on certain days of the week in the 8th and 9th month. That adjustment is made. So this is just a demonstration of that cycle of how they added a 13th month, 7 out of every 19 year cycles. So these boxes, there's 19 boxes here representing years, and then the amount of months per year, 12, 13, 12, 13, 12, 12, 13. That was just them spaced out perfectly, so it's even. Each month begins with the appearance of the crescent moon after the new moon phase and lasts for a full lunation, a moon cycle encompassing all phases of the moon. Since the sum of 12 lunar months is about 11 days shorter than a solar year, a leap month is added every 2 or 3 years, or 7 out of every 19 years cycle. Leap months are meant to keep the calendar in step with the astronomical seasons and make sure that religious observances occur at the correct time of the year, as mentioned in Torah. So what does that mean? Well, here, I'll show you what that means. So we talked about, well, remember how, here's the thing. This is the difference between the historicist view, which puts Jesus' death, of course, in the 70th week, And then, of course, their view necessitates that the cross happens outside of the 70 weeks. Now, we know how they counted years, and we correlate it to Babylonian years, who also had a lunisolar calendar, which is where they're in captivity. So not only did Daniel know when he wrote the prophecies that an actual historic 3.5-year period doesn't have that many days in it because they don't use a lunar calendar, they use a lunisolar calendar. He would have known that because they use the same thing in Babylon while they're in captivity. And so now here's the thing to remember. So we know the 69 the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks leading up to this time period of Jesus' death, that the Jews would have also known, which Luke 3 suggests they're in expectation, expecting the Messiah, wondering if John the Baptist is the Messiah because they were given the decree. And then so many years later, Messiah is supposed to show up, according to Daniel 9. Well, we know they didn't do years based on 360-day purely lunar calendar. So we know, which is the point of the prophecy. So we know they were counting years, and the years were not 360 days long. So that means, however, even if they thought the 70th week was future, it can't correlate to the 1260 or the 42 months because that's not how long. Those aren't actual increments of true years in their history, which is what the 70 weeks were. They were literal history. But they didn't count years or time in such a way that would allow for 42 months to be 3.5 years or 1,260 days. And so if the 70th week is one of the weeks of the 70 in its future, the 1,260 and the 42 months, which they claim are the same thing because that's what Scripture teaches, they're talking about the same prophetic period. It can't be literal because on a lunar calendar, look, can you find a 3-year period on here? Start on whatever year you want of the 19-year cycle that just cycles over and over to add the 13th month in actual history, which is a fact. No matter where you can pick any one of these years, start counting months for 3.5-year length, and at minimum 3.5 years, no matter what year you started on, will never have 42 months. It's impossible. So if the time times in half a time, 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. And by the way, you can't get 1,260 days either. I've done the math. I don't have a demonstration of that, but that's also true. So what does that tell you? Those periods are the same thing, but they represent history in some way of actual time. But what do all the views say that aren't day for year? That it's literal. But literal time can't be 42 months is 3.5 years because any 3.5-year period is going to have 43 months or 44 months because of the added 13th month. So if you say the time periods are literal, you're falsifying Scripture because Scripture is accurate. So if it says 1,260 days or it says 42 months and it calls it 3.5 years, then it would be that. But we know that demonstratably it's historically false, it's biblically false and impossible because you can't get that in literal time. So any interpretation that says those time periods are literal time are automatically ruled out. Because at minimum, you have 43 months. And in literal kept time by the Hebrew people in Daniel's day, during the 70 weeks, which we can count from the decree until Jesus shows up, we know how they counted years. And if the 70th week is future, like they say, and it's one of the weeks of the 69, we know how they kept 69, those years of the 69 weeks of years in literal history. And they're not lunar years, they're lunisolar years, true years, by way of adjustment, which is why we can correlate it with other calendars in archaeology. So the only viable option is that the time periods mentioned are not literal time periods. They are symbolic time periods, and the days represent a year, just like everybody recognizes for the 70 weeks, a day for a year. And so in conclusion, I know of only one group that understands the symbolic prophetic time as each day representing a year, and that's the Seventh-day Adventist Church. and which focuses and puts Christ at the center of apocalyptic prophecy.